have gone to a select committee, even if only for a very short period of time. Because we should have been reaching out to the public, to legal academics, to practitioners and other commentators who all would have been able to make valid points to improve this bill. And so I want to quote, if I may, from one email that was sent by a lawyer to the Attorney-General in the early hours of this morning. And it's in the public domain because he copied it to all MPs. And if I could, I'd just cherry pick and try to pick out about 3 paragraphs. He made the point that in the speech that the Attorney-General, or one of the speeches the Attorney-General was making in the House last night, he was looking around and asking officials for advice on whether future executive orders would be made under the current Section 70 or under the new law. And he went on to write, "You are the Attorney-General of New Zealand. Who is running this show? First, as Attorney-General, you don't know any warrantless search powers in New Zealand, despite trying to justify the proposed law by comparison to powers you do not know. Next, you do not know which public health power is intended to be used in the future, which begs the question, why are you using urgency to pass the most draconian legislation for 88 years? The bill seeks to put virtually unlimited and unchallengeable power to control the liberty of an entire population into the hands of one human being." Does that sound like another type of society you can think on? He went on to write, "The bill does not provide a general right of appeal, and the majority of the House blindly have the Prime Minister's back. Most people do not have the wherewithal to take judicial review proceedings. And, as the Honourable Michael Woodhouse points out, the overbroad purpose of prevention adds significant difficulty in challenging an order." And some of his concluding remarks were, "Moreover, how can this bill be something done by ambush under urgency? As Nicola Willis said, we have had 7 weeks of restrictions, so surely the legislative basis for moving to level 2 should have been considered and tabled before late on Monday of this week in order to allow a democratic process. That is not democracy, that is a circus. It is shameful. This is the most draconian piece of proposed legislation ever seen in this country, at least since," and he quoted a Depression-era Act of 1932. "This is a government that was asleep in allowing, indeed encouraging, the importation of the virus by telling people to rush home to avoid self-isolation. Months after foreseeable risks, this government continues to make panicked reactions that are destroying individual lives and livelihoods, and now democracy itself." And so I thank that gentleman for his detailed and considered email. I hope following government speakers will answer some of the questions he raised in it and respond to the concerns, and as I say, I have only been able to highlight a few of them. Well, let me pick up again on the point that the Ministry of Justice was making. All New Zealanders wish to continue to lock in the gains that we have achieved together during the COVID-19 crisis. We've all been looking to minimise the risk of further importations or community transmission of this disease. That has never been in dispute, and it isn't now. And it's why there was such unity and firm resolve in this House when we voted to suspend at the end of March and place our country under lockdown. Public support for those initiatives has been evident in neighbourhoods around the country where physical distancing has been observed and people have worked from home wherever possible, while essential workers have continued performing their vital roles under stringent rules and often challenging circumstances, and I'm sure we thank them all. We owe a huge debt of gratitude to everyone in our team of 5 million who's assisted us to reach the point where we can now move to level 2 tonight. Not a moment too soon. The government has repeatedly made its expectations clear of all of us throughout the period since the crisis began, and the Prime Minister repeated her expectations, albeit not all that clearly at times, during her media conference when she announced the decision to move to level 2 in her media conference in the Beehive Theatrette on Monday afternoon. But there are clear expectations from the public that the level 2 regulations will be justified, reasonable and necessary. And as I stressed in my previous speeches, and so have many of my colleagues, the cruel and inexplicable constraints on religious worship tangihanga, weddings, funerals and so on are anything but reasonable. New Zealanders are distraught that the government has refused to make the changes despite being offered the opportunity in some supplementary order papers today. For that reason alone, we should be cautious in proceeding with this legislation, and alarmed that it's had such a truncated process under urgency. Last night, Kerry Allen called me out, I think, for comments that I had made about the urgency process. So I want to point out that the Attorney-General wrote to me and put through a courteous phone call at 5 o'clock on Monday evening, but he wanted a response by 10 o'clock the next morning. Well, I don't know any time that a caucus, particularly when flights are not operating and members are in their electorates the length and breadth of this country, could possibly meet to have a considered approach to a bill that they haven't seen and the bill wasn't available, and have a response in by 10 o'clock the next morning. So I say to Kerry Allen, her comments last night were disingenuous, they were wrong, and she should not purport to suggest that this was just urgency as we know it. It was not, it could not be. No party caucus is able to consider its position under those circumstances. So that's why I say it's been very poor process. Some laws do need to be considered and enacted at speed. No one denies that. We've done it, and all previous governments have done it. But this government has had weeks since we went into the lockdown to get its arrangements for level 2 under control, clearly articulated and understood by members of the public, and to have taken the time, albeit with a truncated select committee process, to pass such a bill, if needed, through the Parliament. Yesterday morning, we requested a briefing from the Attorney-General and some of his officials, and I acknowledge that we received that, although the Attorney-General wasn't able to participate in it. And so, of course, the officials weren't able to engage in the more political aspects of that discussion. So it was of some value, but only of limited value. So, sir, let me just return to the point that I made in my first speech, because it's all about the whole purpose of this bill. The Attorney-General was right at that point to highlight the fact that for our economic and social prosperity, we need to go to level 2. Livelihoods have been put at risk, jobs have been lost, many people have gone on to benefits, many businesses have gone under, many more sadly will in the weeks and months ahead. And we all collectively share grave concern about that. We all collectively wish to and need to see our economy get strengthened, get back on track, for businesses to have the confidence to take on staff, for investors to have the confidence to invest, and so forth, particularly for industries such as tourism. But a move to level 2 was never dependent on the enactment of this bill. And our civil liberties have been put at risk in ways that cannot be justified, and that in weeks and months ahead I'm sure will be shown not to have been justified, and that, sir, was too high a price to pay.
The Honourable Chris Hipkins.
Mr. Speaker, in fighting COVID-19, New Zealand went hard and we went early, and we are now enjoying the success of that effort. Mr. Speaker, we shut our country down far sooner than just about any other country in the world, when our case numbers were still very, very low. And the result of that is that we not only flattened the curve, we squashed it. The last thing New Zealanders want to see now, as we come out of the other side of a very harsh 7 weeks, is to see that curve tip back up in a dramatic fashion. And that is what we are working to stop. Let's be very clear about that. The government on this side of the House does not want to see the enormous sacrifice that New Zealanders have made over this last 7 weeks be in vain. We want to lock in the gains that we have made and ensure that COVID-19 cannot get a foothold. We have seen in the House in the last 24 hours some passionate speeches about civil liberties, some passionate speeches about good parliamentary process, and they've been very, very well made. And they've been very good points, very legitimate points that as a parliamentarian, I agree with many of the points that have been made by members opposite. COVID-19 respects none of those things. The reality is this virus will grab a foothold wherever it can. It does not respect civil liberties. It does not respect something as sacred as a funeral. If someone goes to a funeral who has COVID-19 and there are other people at that funeral who are in high-risk categories and that virus is spread, there could be more deaths from that funeral. That would lead to greater tragedy for all those involved. So I acknowledge funerals are a tragic time. They're a time when we come together to comfort the grieving. But COVID-19 doesn't respect that. It simply doesn't respect it. And we as a country have to stick together by staying apart. That is the reality. We do not want COVID-19 to take off in New Zealand, given the success of the sacrifices that we have made so far. Now, the opposition asked, why can't we have level 2 under the existing laws? And I think the Attorney-General has pointed out that level 2 under our existing legal framework would potentially be harsher than level 2 under this law. This law actually allows for more moderate action under level 2 than could be taken under under the existing law. So this law is actually about making sure that we can get New Zealand moving again, we can get our economy moving again, we can get people back to work, but we can keep New Zealanders safe in the meantime. No one in this House should feel comfortable curtailing civil liberties, curtailing other things that New Zealanders in normal times would take for granted. I did not feel comfortable sitting on that side of the House when Jerry Brownlee brought a bill to the House that curtailed the civil liberties of Cantabrians, that confiscated their property rights in urgency after the Christchurch earthquakes. But it was the right thing to do. It was an extraordinary set of circumstances, and Parliament needed to take extraordinary action in those cases, and Jerry Brownlee did the right thing in bringing that legislation to the House, and it did make us all feel uncomfortable, and there was fiery debate at the time, and I think, and I do want to say this, probably wasn't said to Jerry Brownlee at the time very much, he was placed in an impossible situation where no one was going to be happy with his response, and I actually think he did pretty well on balance overall of managing that immediate aftermath of the Christchurch earthquakes, and it did mean that Parliament had to make some tough decisions to back the actions that he had to take that ultimately curtailed people's liberties, potentially took away their property rights, and left a whole lot of people feeling pretty unhappy. No doubt about it, this legislation will leave some people feeling that their civil liberties have been curtailed and that they're having to make further sacrifice. We need to do that because we do not want to see a greater tragedy in New Zealand. There are hundreds and hundreds of people dying every day in other countries who did not take the action that New Zealand has taken. They will suffer a much longer lockdown, and if they come out of lockdown sooner, they will potentially see their curve explode, their health systems overrun, and thousands of people a day dying. That is something we've avoided in New Zealand, but to keep avoiding it, we'll have to stay vigilant. This legislation creates the right framework for us as a country to stay vigilant, and I support it.
The Honourable Jerry Brownlee.
Mr. Speaker, no one is disputing that there is a need to stay vigilant. No one's disputing that we all need to continue following the public health advice that's been so prevalent and so much driven into us or drilled into us over the last 7 or 8 weeks or longer. And I think need to be continually repeated messages. I found it fascinating that we have to tell some people that it's a good idea in most circumstances to wash their hands, that we should also clean down hard surfaces. Those basic sorts of things, yep, we've got to keep doing it, and we've got to also maintain respectful distance for a time longer. But the question is, when there is no pandemic notice and no epidemic notice, who's making the decision that we continue to have these restrictions that can be now imposed on us if this bill passes by a simple notice, largely driven out of the Prime Minister's office, and enforceable with immediate fines and possibly court action. That doesn't seem to me to be a regime where the whole team of 5 million or so is being asked to put all hands to the pump and get stuck into beating this thing. And the worst of it is that the price that's being paid for that win is going to be decades long for all New Zealanders. And it bothers me that as we have seen now the benefit of New Zealanders' largely voluntary response. Won't get into the issue of legalities, that's got a bit more to play out yet. But largely voluntary response that I think would have been there regardless of what law was particularly called on, because of the circumstances that existed 7 weeks ago. The benefits from that are not now being realised to the extent that they should be. It won't be long before the number of New Zealanders losing their jobs every day and going on to the job seekers benefit. And remember that that's only a fraction of those who are losing their jobs. There are many more who don't qualify for that, who would have been in work. That number will very quickly escalate to a daily total bigger than the entire number of people infected by COVID-19 over the last 7 weeks. Now, if you put that into some perspective, sir, it gives an opportunity, I think, to show a lot more trust in New Zealanders. Because the other thing that's not being recognised here is that we are never going to be without it. Yes, there will be a vaccine at some point, and there will have to be other vaccines as there are mutations of this particular COVID virus, but it's not imminent. And so we are going to have to work out how we live with it. Are we going to be in a level 3 lockdown right to the duration as far as, for the foreseeable future? I want to congratulate the government for accepting the limitation of 90 days or so before Parliament reaffirms any actions that are taken under this bill. That's a good thing. The good thing about it is it will mean that the decision makers, in this case one decision maker, the Prime Minister, will have to think about all the broad consequences of any decision that's made. I want to acknowledge the government for deciding that the enforcement officers couldn't be just anybody plucked off the street, given a badge, as it were, and told to go around knocking on doors and using the powers if they thought it was reasonable in their view. There is now, as Crown employees or Crown appointees or Crown contractors, the opportunity for a great deal more control over that. It's important. I think that's good. But I'm disappointed that they could not have seen that it was an opportune time to include the whole of the Parliament in the consultation only on the Section 11 decisions. We did move an SOP, it was defeated by the government, that would have had the Prime Minister consulting, that means picking up the phone and talking to the Leader of the Opposition when there was a proposal to introduce some Section 11 amendments. Now, consultation doesn't mean have to do as they're told, or must listen to every little point, or consider every little point. It just means have a discussion. This Parliament has a party of 55 on this side of the House, largest party in the House, most voters, largest number of voters per party of any in the House, but the government has decided no, consultation on that basis, absolutely not. I think that's a weakness in the bill that's being passed now. One of many. Mr. Speaker, the other thing that bothers me a little bit about this is under those Section 11 notices, you start to analyse, sir, in your head, what are they going to be used for? And one area we've seen, of course, is perhaps a continued restriction on church services, perhaps a continued restriction on the funerals. We're told that the number is going to be 10 for those sort of activities, 10 people. A week ago, it was going to be 100. It's gone down to 10. And maybe in another week's time or 2 weeks' time, it'll be expanded out a little bit more. That's one area that is of concern. The next, though, is in the hospitality area. I do worry that some of the influences in this bill, particularly from the police, may be a sort of an underlying desire to have some sort of local alcohol policy applied across the whole country. I would hate to see uniformed policemen going into bars, counting heads, checking times, measuring distances, and all the any other restriction that might go into one of these. That's not good use of police time. Because one thing we can be sure of is that while the country's been diverted over the last X number of weeks, worried about this COVID virus, crime has continued. And it's also a known fact that when you do have a disaster of this sort that you're trying to deal with, a crisis or whatever you want to call it, criminals always find a way to benefit from it. And so I don't want to see the police made some sort of pseudo crowd control organisation. I think they came dangerously close to that with some of that footage that was shown of them shuffling people off Sumner Beach a few weeks ago. That was not a good look. And to tell New Zealanders who were quite peaceably going about things, keeping their distance, that it was okay for them to be running on a beach but not sitting there having a bottle of water was, I think, a bit of a disgrace. And it sort of worries me that many of that type of element is captured here. I feel sorry for those police staff who were required to do that, because they are New Zealanders as well. They think like the rest of us. They enjoy the freedoms that the rest of us enjoy. And they don't particularly, I'm sure, like having to enforce stuff that in the end is a little bit on the petty side. So we're not supporting this bill, because there has to be a line in the sand that at least starts to say to New Zealanders there is some light at the end of the tunnel, that we are going to be able to work out how to live with this virus in the world in the future, because it will not be going away, it will not be totally eradicated, and it probably hasn't even inflicted the greatest amount of damage that it will eventually, because of many other countries in the world where we just don't even know what's going on. So, yep, we've got to do some things that protect our local economy. But part of it has to be trusting New Zealanders to accept that in this new environment, they've got to do what is best for them and what is best for the country. And unfortunately, this bill takes away that sort of element of trust. Takes away the element of discussion with New Zealanders about what would be a good thing to do. And most concerning of all, it concentrates all of the decision-making in the hands of one person, the Prime Minister, without any requirement for what the Prime Minister must consider before deciding to gazette the circumstances that will lead to a Section 11 notice. And be clear, it's the Section 11 notices that will put the restrictions on church services, the restrictions on attendance at funerals, the restrictions on public gatherings, the restrictions on cafes, the restrictions on bars, and you could go on forever. But in the end, we need to lighten up a little bit, trust that New Zealanders have done a good job and will continue to keep up those public health messages, and make sure that we are all aware that this is something we live with from this point on.
The Honourable Ron Mark.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to make a short call to once again reaffirm that despite all the conversation and the debate we've heard, and I acknowledge that there has been some serious and genuine debate and some serious and genuine expressions of some concerns from the opposition, that New Zealand First will be supporting this third reading of this bill. I've got to say, Mr. Speaker, I am reminded at times like this that of a view that I've long held from 20-odd experiences in Parliament, that 90% of the people who come to this House come here for genuine reasons. They truly do want to make the lives of New Zealanders better. We may approach some of the problems from different philosophical views, and we may approach it from a party perspective. But generally speaking, in all my time here, I stand by the view that 90% of the people that come here, probably 95%, come here and strive to do the very best they can for New Zealand. There are also times when one finds themselves here in government, and other times when one finds himself in opposition. And there are times in government when some hard calls have to be made, and one does reflect and wonder, how one might approach that particular decision being made by the government of the day if one was in opposition. And it's interesting to hear, and it's good to hear Minister Hipkins say that if he were in opposition right now, he might well be expressing some of the same concerns. And it's good to hear him acknowledging the Honourable Jerry Brownlee, who carried the torch for his government through the difficult times of the 2 Christchurch earthquakes and through Kaikoura. And my children and my grandchildren are still living in Christchurch and have lived through all of that and have noted that it is tough being in government at times. And there are decisions that have to be made that don't sit well with our norm, the way we normally would do things. COVID, as Minister Hipkins said, does not respect any of the norms. And we have to, as a nation, be proud of the fact that at this point in time we've taken some hard decisions, we've paid a massive price, and the price is still going to continue to be paid for a little bit longer yet. We know that. But we have smashed COVID. Let's be clear about that. We've made massive gains. The danger is, one, that every corporal who becomes a section commander of an infantry section knows, that every second lieutenant who becomes a platoon commander knows, that every captain or every major who becomes a company commander or a lieutenant colonel who becomes a battalion commander knows, and knows well. And it is this: you are your most vulnerable at your time of victory. When you have taken the objective and you think you've won, that's when an astute enemy knows you're weak. We're at that point, Mr. Speaker. We're at that point right now where a good decision or a bad decision can undo everything in the blink of an eye. None of us like what's happening. I've had to deal with people through my electorate office who have lost loved ones. Do I like the fact that we've imposed these restrictions on them? No, I hate it. It cuts. If it were one of my family, how would I feel? No one likes some of these restrictions that we're now going to have to put in place through this piece of legislation. But it's better to have a ball-peen hammer to deal with the challenges than to be exercising the sledgehammer that a state of emergency would have us do. On balance, Mr. Speaker, I want to recognise and pay tribute to the opposition for doing their job. But this is the right decision. This is what we need to do. And if we come out of this harder and faster and back and moving quickly as we re-establish our businesses, re-establish some norms in our lives, and are able to hold memorial service for our loved ones that we have lost, not necessarily through COVID. I've got a string of veterans, and every day on Facebook I see another veteran has died. Every day. Very often 2 or 3. And it pains me to know that all their mates will not be able to attend those funerals. There will be no guard of honours. There will be no gun carriage. There will be no gathering at the RSA after. It pains me, but that is the reality we are having to deal with. And we will pick these things up with memorial services in time in our own little ways. My heart goes out. But this is the right thing to do. New Zealand First will support the third reading of this bill.
Brett Hudson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise to support it in continued opposition to this bill. Let's make no mistake, the powers within this bill give the government, and it's the executive government, not its agencies, enormous scope to curtail the civil liberties of New Zealanders under any conditions related to COVID equal to what they have seen over the last 7 weeks. And now, as we are debating in the third reading, we still have a situation where the bill that is actually before Parliament and will soon be voted on is not what was put on the tin by the government when it introduced it. And the public have a right to rely on the statements of government and its ministers when they say they are doing something for a purpose, but then they discover that the purpose is actually not that which was articulated. We were told, the public were told, that when this bill was introduced, that this was about being able to manage, set compliance conditions and manage enforcement in level 2. In fact, it was stated we had to do this to get to level 2. Now, that is actually not factually correct. It's not absolutely necessary. We were in level 2 a number of weeks ago. These powers weren't available then. We did it then. We could certainly do it again. But we were told that it was needed for level 2 and beyond, which is level 1. But we've learned as we've gone through this extremely shortened process under urgency that the powers, the provisions in this bill and the powers it unlocks are also available should we return to either level 3 or level 4. That despite the fact that we already have a legal framework for dealing with this pandemic under level 3 and level 4 risk protocol or risk profiles. They include the Epidemic Preparedness Act, the Health Act, and the Civil Defence Emergency Management Act. We've been told by this government, that, and the Attorney-General in public said that there was no enforcement gap under the lockdown. So there's no gap in the powers under the existing framework for level 3 or 4 conditions. So there's no reason why level 3 or 4 should be included within the provisions for this suite of capability and powers to deal with level 2 or level 1. So I sought to test that through the process, Mr. Speaker, and challenge the Attorney-General, the Minister in charge of the bill, on why it was the case that these powers were in some way different for the ordinary New Zealander. I'm not saying that the wording's exactly the same. I'm not saying that every provision in the Health Act or CDM Act are mirrored in this, but for the ordinary New Zealander, for them lockdown meant the government could tell them exactly what they could and couldn't do, when they could go out of their homes and for what purpose, that if they could work from home, if they could work at all, they would have to work from home, that if they did go outside for exercise, there were conditions around what that exercise could be, how far away from their home it could be, under which conditions they could drive there, that what businesses could open and under what conditions they could open, and what businesses the public could or couldn't access. We are left now with a position of a suite of powers which mirror the ability to do that level of impingement on civil liberties. As I say, they may not be exactly the same as the powers in the existing legislation, the Health Act and CDM Act, but for the common New Zealander who's experienced lockdown for now 7 weeks or just about, the powers in this bill enable the same level of impingement on their rights. So I challenged the Minister on what was different, or not what was different, what was materially different, or what was constraining powers. He started off by saying, actually, this is more constrained because for warrantless entry onto premises, the constable will have to report on it. Well, actually, that's a good thing, but there's no reason why that provision couldn't have been an amendment to the Health Act and the CDM Act, and actually should be, because it's probably a good idea under level 3 and 4. On its own, it is not a reason to have a new legal framework and powers that include the ability to use it under level 3 and 4. Then the Minister said, it's actually needed because this has got an ability to control the basis under which businesses can open and operate. Well, I refer we're still under level 3 at the moment, so I refer the government back to lockdown. During this whole process, the government has decided what businesses can and can't open, the nature of how customers can enter those premises, such as supermarkets, which have limited numbers, or dairies, which have one in and one out, why dairies can open but butchers can't, how under level 3 a business could reopen as long as it was contactless ordering and either delivery or pickup. So the government's either saying that it didn't have the lawful authority to do that under the pre-existing framework, so it's necessary to be in this new bill, in which case that opens one large can of worms, or if it claims it did have the lawful authority to do that over the last 7 weeks, then it is not necessary for that part of the provision to be in this new bill. To the extent where it isn't necessary but may be desirable, I go back to the point they could have made that amendment into the Health Act, possibly into the CDM Act, and to the extent they needed the separate bill could have been and should have been limited to alert levels 1 and 2, which is what the government actually said when it introduced it. So then the Minister said, no, it's got further constraint on the powers because Parliament will have to confirm an order made under Section 11, and if it doesn't confirm it, that is revoked. Well, the confirmable instrument is a very important part of our constitutional protections. And ordinarily, it's used for matters that are expected to persist for some time, longer than a single order under this bill, and particularly not in areas which are so severe in their potential curtailment of civil liberties. And so the point more than that, though, that I would make about the bill as it may shortly be enacted, is that Parliament may not be able to make a determination on that confirmation for up to 60 days after the government's given itself the power to do things. What is more, there's an explicit provision that says if Parliament doesn't confirm the order, and therefore it is revoked, that any action taken under it is still valid. So if Parliament says the order was wrong and shouldn't have been done, there is no remedy for the persons affected by that order for the period until Parliament makes that decision. But if it was held, nonetheless, that such notices should be confirmable instruments, then again it goes to my point that for level 3 and 4, which are already dealt with under an existing legal framework, which includes the Health Act and the CDM Act, that amendment should have been made to those acts, and that this bill should have been limited to alert levels 2 and 1, which is precisely what the government said it was for when they introduced it. We are debating a bill, and if the numbers stay the same, unless the Greens suddenly reawaken and rediscover their passion for civil liberties, or New Zealand First discover that they truly do believe in the common New Zealand bloke and blokess, then this thing will pass. And it is going to pass in a way that allows the executive government, to do things to New Zealanders that they haven't been able to do to date, and they were sold on it being something else. I want to touch upon a part of the debate that didn't rage, it was discussed, about who it should be that issues these orders and has the power. And we were told that some legal academics think it should be the government because it's accountable democracy, people can vote them out. And ordinarily I wouldn't disagree with that. But in the area where you are fundamentally locking people down, where their liberties are constrained so much, it should be the government that brings the bill, Parliament decides whether or not it can be used, but the execution of those powers should be at arm's length from political manipulation. It's actually why it's right under the current framework that is the Director General of Health under the Health Act and the Director of Civil Defence Emergency Management under the CDM Act, because it takes away the risk or imputation that the powers are being used with some political agenda in mind. So flipping that over to be the Minister of Health will simply reduce confidence within the public that there won't be any political machinations or ideas or agendas in any decisions that are made under this. Lastly, I'll just briefly touch on the enforcement officers piece, which could have allowed almost anyone, such as the community checkpoint operators, to be given a clipboard and suddenly make all sorts of enforcement decisions. I'm a little concerned about the language that remains, which is engaged by the Crown. And I just wonder, I didn't get the opportunity in the Committee of the Whole, but I just worry that perhaps if a group received government funding for, say, mental or physical well-being, that they could be considered to be engaged by the Crown. We do continue to oppose this bill.
Marama Davidson.
Mr Speaker, the Greens are cautiously supporting and will be monitoring the public health, COVID-19 public health response bill. Mr Speaker, what we are very clear about is that every life matters, no matter what age, no matter what community, no matter what background or experience you have had, and that has been the driving force behind the public health collective community approach in the way that the government has operated. And that very strategy is in fact what has also helped to minimise the impact of the very communities who stand to be harshly impacted on the most. Those with the least resource, those with the least support, those whose immunities are compromised, those with long-term historical situations of being undermined by the current systemic biases in our health system. And that is why the Greens have continually supported the overall approach of this government in putting the public health and safety and well-being of everybody first, unlike many other countries and many other approaches which have deemed some lives less important than others, some lives less valuable than others. And that is the starting point of why we are looking to ensure that there is then a clear set of rules and a legal framework to be sure about what our police and what our ministries and agencies can actually do to uphold that approach, and that not having a clear legal framework and not having clear guidelines will also negatively impact on the very communities that the Greens, that I, have long been standing up for. The very communities who have the least power and resource and networks and lobbying power to be able to have a strong influence in this very House of Representatives that has long been historically putting particular groups of people and communities at a disadvantage. We do need clear legal framework and the architecture behind what our agencies, our state agencies and our government agencies do to ensure the safety and well-being of all of our people. And that is our starting point. And yes, we must have every caution over the way that our civil liberties are being disrupted. And again, we have long been a clear voice in that instance, and we will continue to monitor with caution and be wary of the disruption of those very civil liberties, of the very way that we uphold to be able to live and move and breathe in this country. And Mr. Speaker, that is why we are being very clear and worked really hard to put in place further checks and improvements on the disruption of those civil liberties. But let me be also clear. This is a global pandemic, the likes of which I have not seen in my lifetime in this House, the likes of which the Green Party has not had to deal with in our history. And those are extra considerations. Those are massive challenges that require, yes, a political balancing of disrupting our civil liberties. And we understand why there has been the need, the safety first, the collective well-being first need to disrupt those civil liberties. We also understand the validly held, the passionately held worries that are coming from different communities right now to the ongoing disruption of those very liberties. And I do again want to acknowledge the valid concerns of Māori communities, low-income and brown communities who have long been at the unfortunate hand of the systemic racism and bias within our police and justice system. That much no longer even needs debating. It is very well established, including with the acknowledgement of the police themselves, who I continue to look forward to working with as they seek to correct that injustice, that colonial, historical and present-day injustice that they themselves acknowledge needs turning around. And it is in that context which we have received fair outcry against the way that this bill has seemed to continue to run over those civil liberties of those communities in that context. And we need to be absolutely clear that these broad-ranging powers will not continue to exacerbate those very inequalities that have always existed, that we will not see police or enforcement officers busting into my Manurewa and South Auckland communities as opposed to those house parties in Remuera. We will need to all be very clear that this is not what this bill can continue to support. And we are all on record to make sure that we do not continue to see those injustices applied the way that they have been for such a long time. Mr. Speaker, I wanted to go through very quickly some of the checks on warrantless entry powers that we have worked hard to be able to stand here and keep supporting the public collective.
I apologise for interrupting the member, but it is coming up to 1 o'clock. The government has indicated that it does not wish to continue urgency. The House stands adjourned until 2 p.m. today.
Obama's staff felt it might not be possible to give intelligence on Russia to Donald Trump's staff, or for that matter, why the Obama people thought they had the right to withhold national security information from an incoming American president who had just won a national election. But Rice didn't need to elaborate. There was only one